Okay, today we're going to talk about chapter 3 from our book, and this is about alternatives to experimentation, the non-experimental designs that we can come up with. Uh, it's important to keep in mind that its non-experimental approaches are used when it's not ethical to do an experiment or really possible to do an experiment. So let me give you an example. Something that wouldn't be ethical is if we wanted to study alcoholics by or the children of alcoholics. We couldn't do a study where we send free drink coupons to create alcoholics. It's just not ethical. Or studies that aren't possible. If we wanted to study abused children, we have to study them after the fact. We can't get parents to abuse their children. Do you think maybe you could hit your kids a little more? We're trying to do research here. It just doesn't work. Um, Internal validity is important. Experiments are very high in internal validity. Um, Non-experimental approaches tend to be low in internal validity. What is internal validity? It comes from John Stuart Mill, who is a philosopher, and he talks about the method of agreement, which is if there's some event A, which is followed by some event X, then there's a possibility that A causes X. And similarly, he talks about a method of difference where if A is absent, then X should also be absent. So if you put those two together, you get the joint method of agreement and difference, which says if A happens, X happens. If A doesn't happen, then X doesn't happen. So that A becomes a necessary and sufficient condition for X. And the same thing happens when we do experiments. If we have an independent variable present, we see a change in the dependent variable. And if the independent variable is not present, then we see no change. And so we can ascribe the change in the dependent variable to our independent variable, hence internal validity, ability to make causal statements. As I said, experiments are inherently high in internal validity. Again, if you give somebody 3 Red Bulls and then measure their heart rate, you can be pretty sure that their increased heart rate was caused by drinking 3 Red Bulls. Well, this is redundant with what I've already said. I'll just point out, too, that in experiments, you're assigning people to treatment conditions. And so that gives you much greater control also of the entire procedure. So you're deciding who gets 3 drinks of Red Bull and who gets 3 drinks of water. So you're controlling the antecedent conditions, which allows you to make these causal statements. External validity is all about, can you go from the lab to the real world? For example, bystander intervention studies are high in external validity. People need help in the real world, and so we can study whether people help other people in the real world experimentally. But most experiments are run at universities on college students, and that's a problem because college students aren't like everyone else in the world. And so that becomes an external validity issue. But the extent to which we can generalize our findings outside of the laboratory is what external validity is all about. Non-experimental studies tend to be high in external validity because they're occurring in the real world. So we're not just studying a laboratory phenomenon with college students, we're studying things that actually happen. We talk about the degree of manipulation of antecedent conditions. Basically, are you assigning people to the conditions of the experiment, which would be high, or are you just observing people as they pass through their lives? That would be low in the manipulation of antecedent conditions. So that varies from high to low. Also related to this is the degree of imposition of units. If it's high, that means that only a few data points are basically recorded or asked for. So you might ask people, how many hours of TV did you watch yesterday? And so it's going to vary between 1 and 20, or 0 and 24. A low imposition of units, low degree of imposition of units would be something like, what media were you exposed to? So it's a very open-ended kind of question, and there can be any of a number of possible answers to that. Okay, let's just start talking about non-experimental approaches, starting with phenomenology. This is when you use your own experience as a source of data. And this was very popular among early psychologists. To give you one example, Gestalt psychologists. Gestalt psychology is all about the fact that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts in our conscious experience. And an example of this is a phenomenon called transposability. It's easy to give an example of. I won't sing, but I can play out a few notes, and then you can see if you can recognize the tune. If it's ba-da-da-da-da, I'm going for happy birthday there. But you recognize the tune, whether it's me going ba-da-da-da-da, or if I play it on a trumpet, or on a piano, or if I sing it in Italian. You still recognize that because it's the melody that rises above the sum of the parts. So it doesn't matter what you're playing it on. It's the melody that stands out. And that's an example of phenomenology. Not very experimental. It can lead to experiments, but yeah, so you're just using your own experience as a source of data. Case studies are used all through psychology. Famous examples of this are, and it's when one person or a few people are studied by some outside observer. A famous example is Piaget, who developed theories on psychosocial development by studying his own children. And so he comes up with stages like the sensory motor stage and pre-operational and concrete operations and formal operations. That these are the psychosocial stages that children pass through, and he developed that from case studies. All early ideas about how therapy should take place come from case studies too. So, for example, Freud. Your book incorrectly states that Anna O was one of his patients. Anna O was actually Freud's colleague, Brewer's patient, but they tried psychoanalytic techniques on her, and she really loved it. She called it chimney sweeping, and Freud and Brewer were like, we're on to something here. They eventually split over Freud's belief in the seduction hypothesis, which was that all later neuroses were caused by childhood sexual trauma. Freud said yes, Brewer said no. But we can look at other psychologists too. Alfred Adler, who was a colleague of Freud's, he came up with his theory from case studies too. He's well known for things like the inferiority complex and birth order research. And then Albert Ellis developed his theory of rational emotive behavior therapy from case studies also. That's important because Ellis and Beck really are the founders of all cognitive behavioral therapies, which is the dominant school in therapy today. They provide exceptions to accepted ideas, etc. An example of something like this is Kubler-Ross, who developed the stages of grieving. Those are the stages that people go through. She was a hospice nurse, but this applies to any people going through a trauma. So like somebody breaks up with you, or your pet dies, or parents get divorced or something. But people go through the same stages, which are denial, followed by anger, followed by bargaining, then depression, and then finally acceptance. And so that's something that's developed from a case study approach also. Case studies have limitations, though. A huge issue is this issue of representativeness of the sample that you're studying. So Piaget studied his own children. And so from studying 3 Swiss children in the 1920s, he extrapolates to all children in all times and all cultures, and that can be a problem. Freud studies people in Vienna, 19th century Vienna, suffering from hysteria, which we now would label as conversion disorder, and he's able to build an entire theory of mental illness from that. So we would question the representativeness of his sample, perhaps. Representativeness is an external validity issue. So again, can we relate what we're studying to people in the real world? It's also based on, case studies are based on many times on retrospective data too, which means memory. And is memory fallible? And the simple answer is yes. We'll return to this question though. Deviant case analysis is, it just means different. I think when people hear deviant, they think sexual deviance. That's not what this is about. This is a quasi-experimental approach where you could look at, say, 2 students and one of them who's lost a parent and the other has not, and then you could have hypotheses about how they're going to be different because of the loss of a parent. And so it's not actually experimental because you're not killing one of the parents, you're not controlling the antecedent conditions, but deviant just means different in this case. As I said earlier about retrospective data, memories of the past are not, it's not like a camera, okay? We remember things that we've been told, sometimes that we've pictures that we've seen. We kind of coalesce multiple memories into one memory. So it's important to keep in mind that memories are reconstructed, that they're not just retrieved. And so information may be compromised by your current mood. There's all kinds of research on how mood affects recall. So all I can say to this is amen. Okay, let's start talking about field studies then. And these are non-experimental studies that are done in the field. A good example of this, to contrast to your book, they talk about Fossey, who worked in Rwanda. I think a lot of people are familiar with Jane Goodall, who's a primatologist. She studied chimpanzees in Tanzania. Studying chimps in Tanzania is different from studying chimps at the St. Louis or Kansas City Zoo. You get much more representative behavior in their natural environment than you would get in an artificial environment like a zoo. And so this gives you higher levels of external validity. Again, studying people in the lab may not correspond to studying them in their actual environment very well. A problem that we can run into is reactivity, that people act differently when they know they're being observed. So people act differently when they're on camera. I think that's pretty obvious. Participant observation studies, or participant observer studies, are when someone acts like they're part of the studied group. So this would be like if Jane Goodall put on a chimp costume and then acted like a chimp. I don't think it would work, but that would be a participant observer study. A better example of this, I think, that actually happened, there was a man named Richard Francis Burton, later knighted Sir Francis Richard Burton, but he traveled to Mecca in 1853. He was British, and he wasn't the first non-European Muslim to make the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, but he had to be able to fit in. So he had to know customs, the manners of people, the dress, in order to fit in and appear to be a pilgrim going to Mecca. He was an interesting guy. Just as one other aside, he spoke a number of different languages. He did early translations of things like the 1001 Arabian Nights, which are Scheherazade's stories about Sinbad and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves and Aladdin, if you remember those from your childhood. He also traveled extensively in India, and he did one of the first translations of the Kama Sutra, if you're familiar with that. If you're not familiar with it, I'm not going to explain. The main problem with participant observer studies is that you're pretending to be a member of a group. Burton said that if he had been revealed as a British explorer, he would have been killed in Mecca. Um, really, all forms of spying are participant uh, observation. Let's draw a quick distinction here between field experiments and field studies. So field experiments are experiments conducted in real life settings. So bystander intervention studies are good examples of field experiments. Now you can do those in the lab also, but you could do it on a street corner where somebody just falls over and then you see if they're helped. Field studies are non-experimental. So again, observing chimps in their natural environment would be a good example of a field study. Archival studies are interesting too. It's used a lot in fields like political science. We would call it data mining, where they go into these archival databases and try to pull trends out of them. But my research team has worked extensively we've done a lot of archival research also on things like personal ads, messages in birthday cards. There's a lot of anti-aging um, jokes, I guess would be the right term, in birthday cards. We've done research on advertisements in senior publications like AARP's magazine. Um, but other interesting studies you can do too. So studies of pop culture really rely on archival research. People do interesting studies on things like the number of people killed in summer movies, so the body counts in summer movies, or films that pass the Bechdel test, if you're familiar with that. It's where two female characters, some people say they should be named, some people don't use that as a criteria, but you have two female characters in a movie that talk about something other than a man. And it's amazing the number of films that don't pass the Bechdel test. Star Wars movies, the um, Lord of the Rings movies. And it's interesting too because half the films that do pass the Bechdel test involve women talking about either marriage or babies. And so it's very stereotypical, gender biased filmmaking. It's amazing that people aren't more aware of these things. Let's talk about qualitative research. This is data consisting of words instead of numbers. The big Q, as it's known. I do some of this too. I do what's called life logging, and I wear a camera that takes a picture every 30 seconds. It just passively takes a picture. You just wear it, and it just every 30 seconds takes a snapshot. It has applications in autobiographical memory, but it's also just fun. I'm able to basically have a record of my entire day. I upload the pictures to Sweden. They pull out what they think are what they call moments during the day. But you can screen through all your pictures that it takes. It's part of something called the quantified self movement, if you want to Google that. But it's like Fitbits would be a part of that too. It's just trying to get as much data as you can about your life. A paradigm shift, that's one of the arguments that qualitative research could be part of a paradigm shift. Um, Paradigm shifts are pretty rare. Really, in psychology, we talk about there only being two historically. One was in early psychology, they used to use essentially phenomenology and introspection as their primary research techniques. And then behaviorism came along, and that was a paradigm shift. That was studying animals, that was studying behavior, very different. And then the second paradigm shift, which occurs in psychology, is in the 1960s. The behaviorism shift was in the 19 teens, early 1920s. The second shift occurs in the 1960s. That's a shift from behaviorism to cognitive psychology, a return to studying the mind, but through actual experimental techniques rather than introspection and phenomenology. And this leads us really to the conclusion, which is on this idea of contextual phenomena. Really, all phenomena is contextual, though. When you think about it, if somebody says context is everything in life, if somebody says they love you, It's a huge difference if it's someone who you're in a relationship with, or a family member, or if it's somebody on the street. So really, all phenomena is contextual. And then the chapter ends with ideas about empirical phenomenology, which, I mean, really, empirical philosophy is psychology. It's, well, I guess we could say experimental philosophy. Maybe that's to be more fair, but this is just an attempt to insinuate philosophy and saying it has a place in psychology. But that wraps up the third chapter, and thanks for listening.